The individual who arrived at Nancy Guthrie's residence was convinced that dismantling a single piece of technology would guarantee their absolute anonymity. A gloved hand reached upward, smothered the glass eye, and violently tore the hardware from its mounting, plunging the entryway into absolute blackness, leaving behind, or so it seemed, an utter void of proof. That assumption, however, proved fatally flawed when federal agents later dropped a bombshell that shattered the perpetrator's calculated silence. The digital trail had not vanished. Forensic specialists had painstakingly salvaged the recording in its entirety. Ironically, the very act intended to erase the digital footprint inadvertently preserved the most damning breadcrumbs of this entire mystery. As we delve deeply into this case, we will dissect the very tape the assailant believed to be permanently eradicated, examining the critical error that might finally unmask the shadow-haunting Nancy Guthrie. Detectives point to one catastrophic miscalculation made by the intruder during that fateful midnight visit. They operated under the antiquated assumption that shattering the physical lens would inherently obliterate the digital memory. Yet, the resurrected visuals paint an entirely contradictory narrative. The sequence opens with an ominous silhouette advancing toward the threshold, entirely draped in midnight apparel, complete with tactile gloves and a cowl drawn heavily to obscure any facial geometry. Their gait is deliberate and unhurried, cutting a direct path toward the entryway in a manner that immediately sets off psychological alarms. There is zero lingering. The prowler never visually sweeps the perimeter nor inspects the architecture for hidden countermeasures. Quite the opposite, the Phantom marches dead center toward the doorbell monitor, navigating with the eerie precision of someone who had memorized its coordinates, lunging for the hardware almost instantly. An obstruction suddenly presses against the glass, fracturing the visual feed before the frame is entirely swallowed by the foliage of an adjacent botanical arrangement. Authorities theorize the assailant tore handfuls of greenery from a nearby porch planter to blind the sensor, unaware that obscuring the optics did absolutely nothing to halt the data stream. It merely cast a shroud over the imagery. The system relentlessly beamed its telemetry outward, prompting the frustrated intruder to escalate their tactics by forcibly prying the unit from the brickwork. The feed abruptly terminates, plunging the scene into a digital abyss, a moment where the Phantom undoubtedly felt triumphant in their destruction. What the intruder failed to comprehend was that the most devastating fractions of time had already been locked into the mainframe, and those fleeting glimpses might just expose far deeper psychological currents than the predator ever bargained for. In the agonizing days following Nancy Guthrie's vanishing, law enforcement feared the assailant had effectively neutralized their silver bullet, as the actual security unit had been physically abducted from the premises. Stripped of the physical hardware, there was no onboard storage chip to extract, and no apparent secondary reservoir holding the visual data. Initially, the saboteur's execution appeared chillingly flawless, but cyber forensic analysts brought a level of modern expertise that many predators fatally underestimate. Contemporary surveillance ecosystems are rarely confined to the internal circuitry of their physical shells. Long before the plastic casing was fractured, the operating system was already silently broadcasting its cache across the property's wireless web. This meant that fractured echoes of the encounter had already bounced to cloud-based hubs, completely immune to whatever physical violence was inflicted upon the doorbell itself. Cyber technicians from the Federal Bureau of Investigation meticulously dissected the cloud pathways tethered to the homeowner's profile. They sifted through routing histories, broadcast pulses, and ethereal ghosts of metadata, a grueling, microscopic excavation. It is exceedingly rare for shattered data packets to emerge whole after such an abrupt offline event. Yet, slowly, a spectral outline materialized from the void. Microscopic splinters of imagery, just mere heartbeats of recording, had successfully uploaded in the fleeting moments prior to the hardware's execution. Those salvaged blinks in time gave detectives the power to stitch together the agonizing timeline of Nancy Guthrie's abduction, resurrecting a truth the culprit thought was buried in the dark. As behavioral experts dissected the salvaged frames in agonizing slow motion, subtle psychological tells began surfacing from the static, revealing biomechanics that were shockingly disciplined. There was no erratic flinching, no adrenaline-fueled clumsiness, only the chilling, icy swagger of someone executing a heavily rehearsed operation. The silhouette strides into the detection zone, blinds the optic nerve, and dismantles the casing in one fluid, rhythmic ballet of destruction. Such terrifying fluidity implies a critical reality. The prowler anticipated the surveillance, whereas a typical burglar navigating alien territory instinctively sweeps the environment for alarms. They naturally pivot their heads, visually frisking the perimeter. The figure captured in this haunting playback betrays none of those amateur instincts. Advancing with predatory tunnel vision directly to the lens, they leave investigators wrestling with a terrifying riddle. How did this phantom know the precise geospatial location of that exact security device? There are only a handful of chilling explanations for possessing such intimate architectural intelligence. They either conducted extensive covert reconnaissance beforehand, had been a guest on the premises previously, or spent countless hours lurking in the shadows, intimately mapping out the victim's domain. For the homicide squad unraveling this nightmare, this single revelation fundamentally rewrites the psychological profile of the case, heavily implying that the threshold of Nancy Guthrie was never a crime of mere opportunity. The predator had a targeted destination burned into their mind long before they ever set foot on that concrete step. Moving past the mechanics of the breach technology, detectives shifted their intense psychological scrutiny onto the only remaining puzzle piece: the calculated monster caught in the frame. It was never merely about the disguise or the garments worn, but rather the chilling fluidity of their motion. Experts in criminal behavior scrutinize these grainy surveillance frames, seeking unconscious psychological signatures. They dissect the pacing, the alignment of the spine, the subtle shifts in gaze, and, perhaps most tellingly, what the intruder chooses to completely disregard. Here, the shadowed silhouette exudes a deeply unsettling composure. There is absolutely no urgency in their approach to the porch, no erratic pacing, and not a single tremor of panic. Rather, the intruder advances with calculated, deliberate strides, moving with the terrifying precision of an actor walking through a meticulously rehearsed scene. Such chilling self-assurance is the hallmark of extreme premeditation, pointing to a predator who had played this exact sequence out in their mind 1,000 times over. Yet, beneath the obvious dread of the recording, detectives isolated another seemingly minute, but potentially devastating, anomaly. For a fraction of a second, the outline of a distinct item presses against the fabric of the intruder's coat pocket. While the pixels are degraded, forensic specialists strongly suspect it is a compact electronic unit, akin to a two-way tactical radio. Should this hypothesis hold true, it drags a terrifying new variable into the light, a variable law enforcement cannot simply brush aside: a live line of communication. In the anatomy of a crime, shortwave transceivers typically indicate that this phantom was not operating in isolation. It paints a picture of a coordinated strike, one operative breaching the perimeter, while a ghost partner lingers in the shadows, keeping a vigilant eye on the asphalt and scanning the dark neighborhood. They would be poised to whisper a warning into the earpiece the moment the environment shifted or a neighbor turned on a light. Authorities have yet to definitively identify the bulge in the fabric as a transceiver, but its mere possibility forces a profound and disturbing inquiry. If the masked silhouette haunting Nancy Guthrie's doorstep was actively relaying information to a hidden accomplice under the cover of darkness, then the chilling frames captured by the lens were merely a single gear in a much larger, more malevolent machine. This salvaged digital memory serves another vital purpose, allowing investigators to carve a definitive timeline out of the night's chaos. The sequence is methodical. The phantom breaches the entryway, blinds the lens, and violently tears the hardware from its mount. From that exact second onward, the visual narrative goes black, yet the invisible web of smart technology woven throughout the residence kept silently logging the horror. These were not pictures, but digital pulses. Roughly 25 minutes after the primary eye was blinded, a secondary perimeter sensor triggered a silent alarm in its logs. The algorithm embedded in the security network definitively categorized the disturbance as the biometric signature of a human being. This data point is a terrifying revelation, confirming that the predator lingered in the shadows long after the porch went blind. This fragmented timestamp changes everything, proving the intruder did not simply vandalize the security system and vanish into the night. A dark, unknown sequence was unfolding over nearly half an hour. Then, the digital breadcrumbs revealed something far more sinister. The telemetry linking Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker to her mobile device was abruptly severed. By design, that life-saving wireless tether holds strong provided she stays within proximity, yet her cellular device was found abandoned within the walls of her home. Nancy, however, was gone. Profilers and detectives theorize that the exact moment of the severed connection marks the precise second she was dragged beyond the property line. Consequently, the cold, calculating movements caught on the entryway feed chronicle the grim prologue to the ultimate erasure of Nancy Guthrie. While law enforcement meticulously stitched these fractured moments into a coherent chronology, a haunting realization began to steer the trajectory of the entire manhunt. If the Phantom knew the precise coordinates of the digital eye, what other secrets of the household were they privy to? Neutralizing a defensive measure with such surgical speed is almost never a stroke of dark luck. An ordinary burglar creeping up to an unknown threshold in the dead of night will pause, their eyes darting for infrared glows, avoiding motion lights, and treading with heavy anxiety. Yet, the specter in this video defies every instinct of a common thief. They march on a linear, unwavering trajectory straight for the lens, treating its hidden location as established fact. That single, chilling observation instantly elevates the severity of the case. It forces investigators down a deeply disturbing psychological rabbit hole. The terrifying probability that the residents had been subjected to intense, long-term surveillance. A predator had likely stalked from the periphery, documenting the ebb and flow of daily life, memorizing the hours of vulnerability, and mapping the exact geometry of the security hardware. Behavioral analysts refer to this chilling phenomenon as intimate spatial awareness, a trait found almost exclusively in predators who obsessively stalk their hunting grounds prior to the strike. Occasionally, this mastery of the terrain is born from peering through binoculars across the street, but darker scenarios point to an inside advantage. It could have been gleaned from a fleeting service call, a dropped-off package, a contracted repair, or perhaps by someone who had previously stood in Nancy's living room as a guest. Law enforcement is currently tearing through years of records, desperately tracing every conceivable vector by which a stranger could have mapped the anatomy of her private sanctuary. Because if this shadowed figure had already decoded the floor plan, pinpointed the surveillance, and charted the silent rhythms of the street, it implies a deeply unsettling truth. The architecture of this abduction was drafted weeks, or possibly months, before the fateful night she vanished into thin air. Yet, despite the resurrected digital logs and the painstakingly built chronology, the task force finds itself staring down an impenetrable wall. The identity of the architect remains entirely swallowed by the shadows. A heavy fabric shroud obscures every facial detail, forcing profilers to extract their answers from the silent language woven into the intruder's physical mechanics. Biometric estimations of stature, skeletal framework, sartorial choices, and the unique, rhythmic cadence of their gait become the only threads left to pull. Specialists in visual forensics pore over these frames with obsessive intensity, knowing that the subconscious quirks of human locomotion are nearly impossible for a perpetrator to fake. The distance of a footfall, the slump of the spine, the rigid tilt of the clavicle, these involuntary tells act as a biological fingerprint that can drastically cull a sprawling suspect pool. Since those haunting seconds of video were broadcast to the public, law enforcement switchboards have been inundated with thousands of potential leads waiting to be deciphered. A fraction of these leads originate from citizens convinced they can identify the distinct garments draped over the unknown figure. Meanwhile, other calls trickle in from vigilant locals who recall sensing a subtle, unsettling shift in the local atmosphere during those dark hours. Detectives are forced to meticulously dissect every single claim, fully aware that unmasking a concealed predator frequently hinges on an almost imperceptible fragment of truth. It could be a delayed recollection, a familiar gait, or a microscopic breadcrumb buried deep within those brief, chilling frames that the perpetrator was certain he had permanently erased. Law enforcement remains convinced that buried somewhere within that fleeting digital memory lies the exact clue needed to unmask the shadow who crept up to Nancy Guthrie's threshold. Yet, despite successfully salvaging the digital file, the authorities are still confronted by an incredibly daunting obstacle. It is an undeniable fact that a phantom presence occupied Nancy Guthrie's front steps on that fateful evening. Detectives are certain the intruder dismantled the recording device, yet the subsequent path this phantom took remains entirely swallowed by the darkness. The instant that lens was violently ripped from its mounting bracket, the objective truth ceased to exist, forcing the investigative team to pivot toward vastly more subjective forms of evidence. They had to cast a wide net across the slumbering community, pulling feeds from adjacent properties, municipal intersections, and any conceivable lens that might have caught a fleeting glimpse of an escape. An exhaustive sweep was initiated as police officers went door to door, harvesting surveillance files from every residence flanking the perimeter. The vast majority of this digital harvest revealed nothing but mundane stillness, desolate asphalt, motionless shadows, and a community fast asleep. However, the prevailing theory among seasoned detectives is that the prowler did not simply melt away into the night by walking. The geographical layout surrounding Nancy Guthrie's residence is notably expansive, featuring vast lawns and broad avenues, heavily implying that any successful getaway required an automobile. Law enforcement is currently scrutinizing every single automobile that navigated those sleepy thoroughfares during the twilight hours, harboring the hope that one of those chassis was transporting the very individual who vanished from Nancy Guthrie's doorstep shortly after the feed died. Should the task force successfully isolate that specific set of wheels, they might finally map out the exact trajectory the phantom took after retreating from the entryway. As darkness fell once more, authorities descended upon Nancy Guthrie's lawn to painstakingly retrace the intruder's steps. By this point, the resurrected digital clip had fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the hunt. Yet, seasoned agents suspected that an exponentially more vital clue remained concealed within those brief, terrifying frames of digital capture. The masked intruder operated under the fatal assumption that the surveillance lens ceased to exist the very second it was forcibly dismounted. This predator walked away confident that his tracks were erased forever, entirely oblivious to a technological reality that federal cyber analysts understood intimately. Regardless of active server subscriptions, modern entryway monitors inherently stash microscopic digital echoes deep within hidden cache directories and remote architectural layers. Under the right conditions, these shattered technological remnants can be meticulously stitched back together, which is precisely the breakthrough that occurred in this instance. Elite technicians, collaborating alongside federal operatives, painstakingly resurrected the sequence of events, linking the visual tapestry together, one microscopic still at a time. The newly salvaged recording depicts the shrouded figure advancing upon the stoop with an incredibly chilling level of audacity. There is an utter absence of pause or anxious scanning. Rather, the silhouette marches dead center toward the lens, exuding the chilling certainty of a predator who had memorized his environment. This specific behavioral quirk instantly triggered alarms among the profiling team, as unfamiliar trespassers inherently survey an unknown perimeter before acting. Typical burglars dart their eyes and step with heavy apprehension, whereas this particular intruder glided forward with an eerie, rehearsed intimacy. The shadowy form elevates a hand, deliberately obscuring the electronic eye with a handful of greenery plucked directly from a potted arrangement resting near the entryway. While this action appears trivial at a glance, behavioral analysts point to it as a monumental revelation. The intruder never packed his own tools to blind the security system. By weaponizing the existing exterior decor, the figure betrayed a deeply sinister truth. He anticipated the greenery's exact placement, strongly implying he had stalked that very threshold prior to the attack. Once the electronic gaze is adequately smothered, the prowler violently endeavors to rip the recording unit from its housing. The visual feed shudders chaotically as the hardware is wrestled from the siding. Shards of shattered glass subsequently discovered beneath the installation site suggest an incredibly aggressive strike or a brutal, unyielding extraction. At that precise moment, the visual feed cuts to black, yet the trail of digital breadcrumbs was far from exhausted. Specialized visual technicians immediately went to work, clarifying the salvaged imagery, proving that even a heavily obscured visage could not hide critical, quantifiable dimensions. By utilizing the surrounding architecture of the entryway as a geometric baseline, experts were able to precisely calculate the invader's vertical stature. The resulting mathematical analysis pinned the shadowy figure at an exact elevation ranging from 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches in total height. Authorities additionally zeroed in on his gear, specifically identifying a 25-liter ebony Ozark Trail rucksack, a commercial item primarily distributed through Walmart locations. While ostensibly mundane, such minutiae form the very backbone of modern criminal hunting. Stature, anatomical alignment, retail insignias, and kinetic movement patterns. Every single thread is woven together to construct a comprehensive psychological and physical silhouette of a killer. It was then that the behavioral team recognized a profoundly disturbing nuance. The Phantom exhibited absolutely zero sense of panic. The vast majority of perpetrators captured on digital film radiate undeniable anxiety, characterized by jerky twitches, paranoid glances, and an overwhelming desperation to flee. This specific intruder betrayed absolutely no such fear. His kinetic flow was utterly tranquil, calculated, and possessed the chilling smoothness of a thoroughly rehearsed routine. Psychological profilers examining the tape concluded that this was no amateur. The individual either possessed a lengthy history of subterranean activities or had meticulously visualized this exact violation over and over in his mind. This grim realization fundamentally pivoted the entire nature of the manhunt, establishing an undeniable truth. If this intrusion was practiced, it was devoid of impulsive passion. It was a meticulously orchestrated operation where a predator specifically targeted that exact residence, intentionally electing to strike on that precise evening. This individual operated under the arrogant delusion that his technological prowess could effectively vaporize his sins. Yet, he miscalculated entirely. The physical hardware may have vanished into the dark, but its memory remained intact. However, the fleeting moments captured just prior to the blackout might serve as the absolute linchpin in unraveling the mystery of Nancy Guthrie's fate. As the days bleed into weeks in the search for the missing woman, a chilling truth has begun to crystallize for the detectives assigned to the inquiry. This was a meticulously orchestrated event, devoid of panic, and far from a mere coincidence. Each thread of evidence points to cold, calculated premeditation, beginning with the perpetrator striking under the veil of absolute darkness while the surrounding streets slept. The intruder possessed an eerie awareness of the security system's layout, advancing on the lens with an unwavering, predatory focus. Utilizing items already present on the threshold, the prowler purposefully obscured the device's field of vision. By ripping the hardware from its mounting, the Phantom in the night operated under the fatal assumption that the digital eye had been permanently blinded. Yet, that singular shred of hubris could be the flaw that breaks the investigation wide open. As a brief, fragmented recording somehow outlived the destruction. Within those abbreviated frames lies something much more profound than a facial profile. They reveal a frightening level of poise and an intimate geographical knowledge of the grounds. The prowler's fluid navigation strongly implies a history with the residents, pointing to either prior visits or extensive, obsessive surveillance. That specific psychological footprint instantly shrinks the pool of potential culprits to a disturbing degree. Detectives are now operating on the theory that the assailant was intimately acquainted with the victim's daily rhythms, aware of her vulnerability as a solitary occupant, and cognizant of the exact hour the neighborhood fell dead silent. Furthermore, the attacker possessed a tactical understanding of the surveillance setup and the precise methodology required to dismantle it in a heartbeat. Such sinister precision is almost never the hallmark of an opportunistic drifter. Rather, it bears the signature of a watcher who had been studying their prey for a significant duration. In the shadows of the precinct, law enforcement officials labor intensely to reconstruct the exact chronology of that fateful, pitch-black morning. The primary surveillance feed suffers a total blackout, followed mere minutes afterward by a subtle secondary trigger in the perimeter's motion sensors. Moments later, the biometric transmission from the victim's heart monitor goes horribly dead, establishing a grim sequence of timestamps that authorities are dissecting with microscopic scrutiny. Above this mountain of data looms the single most agonizing mystery of the entire ordeal. Into which pitch-black void did the Phantom vanish once they descended those front steps? Law enforcement has been systematically scouring residential feeds, intersection monitors, and municipal highway lenses spanning the entire district. Every automobile that passed through the vicinity during that critical corridor of time is being meticulously logged, as the key to the escape route might be buried within those fleeting pixels. Pinpointing the exact make and model of that getaway transport could provide the breadcrumbs needed to trace the predator's retreat. Tracking it could lead straight to the doorstep of the monster who stole a woman from her sanctuary, transforming the inquiry from a standard hunt into something far darker. It has morphed into a high-stakes labyrinth of criminalistics, where biological traces undergo intense lab scrutiny, while cyber specialists mine the recovered hardware for hidden ghosts in the machine. Behavioral profilers are carefully dissecting the physical tics and spatial navigation of the assailant preserved in that resurrected clip. No anomaly is too small. Every fragment is being subjected to rigorous testing, side-by-side comparison, and relentless verification. In the world of violent crime, the most microscopic anomaly can shatter an alibi, whether it be a stray epidermal ridge, a minute genetic marker, a blurred license plate, or a handful of salvaged video frames the attacker believed were lost to the void. As the clock continues to tick, the whereabouts of the vanished woman remain a haunting, unanswered question. Her residence, nestled in the Catalina foothills, is wrapped in a heavy, unnatural silence, its entryway transformed into ground zero for a manhunt that has captivated the entire country. Those who love her are left agonizing in the wake of her absence, pleading with the public for any semblance of closure. Detectives remain steadfast, hunting down every whispered rumor and chasing every shadowy thread they can unearth. Meanwhile, lurking somewhere in society, the architect of this nightmare likely rests easy, completely unaware that their desperate attempt to blind a machine actually preserved the very visual evidence that will orchestrate their downfall. Stay deeply connected as we chronicle the next critical breakthroughs in this chilling pursuit for justice. The grim reality of the horrors that unfolded during those twilight hours is undoubtedly still buried deep within the forensic fragments. And even as we speak, authorities are tearing those fragments apart, searching for the final, damning clue.